start by introducing Jillian Cantor, and her book is Margot. And I'm going to introduce each of them by simply reading their first line, the first line of the book. So, when you open Margot, this is what you read. I should begin with the simplest of truths. I am alive. Grabber, right? The I is Margie Franklin. She's a legal secretary in Philadelphia in April 1959. She is, in fact, a legal secretary in Philadelphia. She is not Margie Franklin. She is Margot or Margot Frank. She is Anne Frank's sister. And in this novel, she is still alive and hiding. This is a book about a woman who's hiding her identity, wearing a sweater over the tattooed numbers on her arm. And it's a book about how to go forward with her life and with our life, and as who? Who do we go forward as? The book is doing great. I won't even, wonderful reviews, 3.5 out of 4 stars in People magazine. It's the Ladies Home Journal October Book Club pick, reviews in Oprah magazine as well. Jillian was born and raised in Philly. She has a BA from Penn and an MFA from the University of Arizona, and that's where she lives now with her husband and her kids. She's got a book coming out for teens in 2014 called Searching for Sky. But let's get to the important stuff. Here are some of her recent tweets. This will tell you everything. I #am writing on the patio today with coffee, mountain views, and the cat meowing at the back door. #perfect. Here's another one. Things I almost stepped on this morning's walk. Baby rattlesnake, dead jackrabbit, dead bird. And another recently. So I didn't write any words today, but I thought about words that I want to write tomorrow. That counts, right? Jillian Cantor. Jillian, come on up here.
If I knew my tweets were going to be spoken out loud, I would have put more thought into them. Thank you so much, Amanda, for that introduction. And this is Margot, my novel. I think Amanda did a really good job of kind of telling you what it's about, so I'll maybe tell you a little bit why I wrote it, and then I'm just going to read the short prologue. I read the diary of a young girl when I was 13, probably like most of us do at this point. And at the time, I really remember just relating a lot to Anne. It was really the first time. I'm Jewish. I was about Anne's age when the age Anne was when she wrote it, when I read the book. And I think that was the first time I kind of thought about what my life would have been like if I had grown up in a different time, in a different place. And so I really, it terrified me at 13. And that's what I remembered years later. I remembered that there was this girl, and I felt she was kind of similar to me in a way, and she wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to be a writer. When I picked up the book again when I was in my 30s, I immediately noticed Anne's older sister, Margot, and I had no recollection of her from my earlier reading. I had this vague memory that there were other people in the annex, but I didn't remember she had an older sister. And so I did a little Googling trying to find out about Margot, and I learned a few interesting things about her, but mostly what I learned was that virtually nothing has been written about Margot. There's been so much written about Anne, not just her diary, but fictional things, nonfiction, plays, movies, books. There's been things written about the family in general, and Otto, their father, who did survive the war and published Anne's diary, but virtually nothing. Margot is always an afterthought in the things written about the rest of the family. So I did learn that Margot also kept a diary in the annex, but hers was never found after the war. The other interesting thing I learned was that the reason the family went into hiding when they did was because Margot received a call-up notice from the Germans, so they went into hiding the very next day. They sort of planned for it in the future, but it was vague, but Margot was the reason. So it just kind of struck me that she was a catalyst for going into the annex. She also kept a diary. Nobody had ever really written or thought much about her as more than an afterthought. And I was also an older sister. Margot's 3 years older than Anne. I'm 3 years older than my younger sister. Margot, at least the way she's described by Anne, she's quieter, she's more serious, she doesn't get in trouble. That was me growing up. I was the older, quieter sister. And so I had this connection with Margot, and I felt like if I had been there in that annex, if I had lived in Europe at that time, I would not have been like Anne at all. I would have been like Margot. And I felt like her story was lost. So that was my reasoning for writing the book. Of course, the book is completely fictional. The real Margot did die in Bergen-Belsen with Anne. In my novel, she, well, I don't want to tell you how she got to America. I think that's a spoiler. But in my novel, she didn't die. She moves to America. It's 1959 when the book takes place, and that's the year that The Diary of a Young Girl was made into a movie, and the Hollywood version, and came out. It was doing very well in America. It won a few Oscars. And so my character sort of has to reconcile what she remembers of the annex with what she hears about on the silver screen. So I'm just going to read the one-page prologue so you can get a little taste for it. And Amanda already read the first line, but I'll read it again. I should begin with the simplest of truths. I am alive. You might wonder how this is possibly the simplest of truths when you have thought me dead, when the entire world has thought me dead for so very long. But this, I promise you, is really quite simple in light of all the rest of it. I breathe, and sometimes I eat, and sometimes I sleep. But every morning again, when I wake up, I find myself still breathing. Simple. Really, it is nothing more than science. I can already picture you shaking your head. It's not simple at all, you are saying to yourself. Maybe your face is turning an angry red, and you are yelling that the Red Cross list said I was dead. Maybe you are wondering where I have been, why I haven't found you yet. I've come this far, why not just stay hidden forever? But a person cannot really stay hidden forever. We both know that now, don't we? The truth is, I have wanted to find you for a long time, but I have been afraid. Afraid of what you might think if I told you everything. Afraid of what you've become since I've seen you last. Afraid even of what you might think of what and who I've become. I am not a girl anymore, neither am I a Jew, and I have done things that I can't understand or explain, even to myself. But I promise you this, I am alive. There are simple truths about me. I live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, United States of America, where I am a legal secretary by the name of Margie Franklin. And from there you get to go and see what Margie Franklin's life is like. But I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Jillian. Completely killer. Let me next introduce Lauren Grodstein. Lauren has written The Explanation for Everything. Right off the bat, that use of the word for instead of, I love this. We will get Lauren helping us with that. I love that. Let me read you her first line. The first time Andy met Louisa, she was covered in blood. It's not going where you think. So, Lauren, I could summarize this novel one of two ways, and both of them work. A professor of biology who teaches a course in evolution nicknamed There Is No God must come to terms with students who embrace intelligent design. Or a professor of biology who's lost his wife has to question and eventually rebuild his sense of life's meaning. We've got parallel tracks going in this wonderful, wonderful book. It's gotten great reviews. Washington Post said it was smart, assured, a gripping tale, and I love this, full of destabilizing tectonic shifts, which is, isn't that great? It's a great, great phrase. So Lauren has written two other novels, a short story collection. She's also got a book out for younger readers called Girls Dinner Club under a pseudonym. Jess Elliott was featured as a New York Public Library book for teenage readers, so she crosses lots of boundaries. She and her husband live in New Jersey, and she teaches creative writing at Rutgers, Camden, and helps administer their MFA program. But in keeping with what I promised you all, I'm going to read to you from her social media. First of all, two little quotes. She's been on the road, as all these three authors have. So as a road warrior book tour veteran, she posted, I am more familiar than any person should be with the economy lot at Philly Airport. And something I think we can all relate to, food in airports has no calories, so it doesn't count. She did a great interview about airports and traveling. I love that interview. And here's a lovely other side of Lauren. She has been right here in town. She came here with her father recently, and this is what she posted. It's beautiful. You want to feel lucky? Ride a cable car with your dad and hold on to his sleeve as the thing seems to want to plunge into the bay. Listen as he reminds you about the first time you two were in San Francisco when you were 3 years old and he bought you a pin shaped like an ice cream cone. You still have that pin. You never knew where it came from. Lauren, come on up. Talk to us, read to us. Lauren Grodstein.
This is so great. Thank you guys for coming out on such a beautiful day. It's so nice to meet you and be part of this event with you guys and with you. This is on, right? Yeah, okay. So my novel, The Explanation for Everything, does in fact concern a biology professor. And people have asked me where the book comes from, and it's sort of a hard thing to know. You know, when you write a novel, it often ends up being the out product of all the stuff that's just been percolating in you for a while, and then it sort of bubbles up and out comes, if you're lucky, a novel. If you're unlucky, 700 pages that end up in the garbage after 3 years. I've been on both sides. This book, I think, stems from a lot of places, but probably the one that is most direct is that I teach at Rutgers, which is the State University of New Jersey, and like a lot of, you know, East Coast or West Coast, I guess, college campuses, you meet, most of the people you meet are sort of culturally similar to you. And I had never met any students who didn't just sort of take for granted the basic facts of science or biology. And then I met a student in one of my creative writing classes, and I really was attached to her. She was really smart, really funny, great writer, really beautiful, and she had transferred to Rutgers from a small Christian college in Ohio that didn't have a philosophy department, which was a way of avoiding tricky philosophical questions, and which taught that science was, that the Bible was a scientific and historical text, as well as a religious text. And then she transferred to Rutgers because she wanted to be in a more open-minded environment and because she had family in New Jersey. And like I said, I was very fond of her, and one day we bumped into each other on at the campus Starbucks. And we were talking sort of casually, and she mentioned that she thought that or believed that the Earth was about 6,000 years old. And I looked at her, and I almost like spilled my latte on her, because I never met anyone who would say that out loud in Starbucks. You know, that whisper that. Psst. Do you know how old the Earth is? But like she was just, and it was like, you know, pass the sugar, and I was surprised at two things. One, that she would say that, and B, how angry I was. Like, why should that make me angry? What is it to me? She's not saying, she was certainly not trying to proselytize. She wasn't telling me what I should think. And in fact, she was quite understanding when I said, you know, that contradicts everything that I've ever learned in science class. She said, well, it aligns with everything I've ever learned in science class. I know. And yet, there was no way, I'm not articulate enough, unfortunately, nor did I have such a great marshaling of the facts to be able to change her mind. What was fascinating to me, though, was like the less successful I was at changing her mind, the more enraged I became. And I went home, and she said, well, let's just agree to disagree. And I said, no, we can't. We can agree to disagree on, like, you know, this latte. We can agree to disagree on whether or not the Beatles are the best rock band of all time, but we cannot agree to disagree about the age of the Earth. And she said, okay, well, then I'm right. But there was nothing to gain, I don't think, from me. She was going to take biology at Rutgers. She was not going to fight with the professor. There was nothing for me to gain by disabusing her of her belief in the Bible, but there was a lot for her to lose, I think, if I was successful. Now, she has heard me, we are still close, and she's heard me multiple times on the radio, and she has asked, or anywhere, talking about this, and she's asked me kindly, and so I will now say that she has changed her mind a little bit, and that as she's grown older, her feelings about evolution have indeed evolved, and she now thinks that evolution is a God-directed phenomenon, which frankly lots and lots of people, maybe some of you, believe. But what I was interested in was taking the point of view of, you know, a sort of Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris type figure. Have you guys read, you know, like the God Delusion, those books that really do see religious belief as a grave threat, as a threat to national security, as a threat to morality, as a threat to, you know, sort of the foundations of civilization? What would it be like for a professor who believed those things about religion if he had to take seriously, just for a semester, just for a week even, someone who believes the Earth is 6,000 years old? People have been, at a reading I gave last night, someone came up to me afterwards and said that she was very disappointed that I didn't have all the answers for her. She came up to me afterwards, she said, why did you do, I talked a little bit about all the research I did, because to write about a biology professor required that I go into a lot of biology labs. And I saw things, friends, that you don't want to see. I saw rats with okay, anyway. But and I described some of this research because it's really, if I had to see it, then sometimes I feel like it's my duty or I deserve the fact to gross everybody else out with what I saw. And she came up to me afterwards and said, well, why would you do all that research if you couldn't find the answer? And I'll just leave that question at you. I think there are some answers that won't be found. So anyway, I will read just a bit following Jillian's model. Now that I've told you where the book came from, I'll read just a little bit from where Andy, our professor, first meets Melissa, our creationist student. There are so many issues concerning evolution that scientists haven't even begun to fathom, Melissa. I feel certain there's something you'd find interesting if you just agreed to look. She shook her potato-shaped head. I have a question for you, Professor Waite. He noted that her eyes were surprisingly light, a greenish gray. There are two ways to see the world, right? She said. I mean, there are probably more than two ways, but what I'm asking you here is to imagine two ways of looking at the world. Two ways, Andy said, neither frustrated nor hurried. Fine. There's your way, she said, where everything is accidental, where the fact that the Earth tilts on an axis, the fact that it has a moon to control the tides, the fact that it is just the exact distance from the sun to keep us warm without boiling us alive, and even more than that, the fact that we're here, the fact that we love each other and protect each other is all an accident of timing and chemicals. That's my way? Yes, Melissa said, that is your way, because that is the way of Darwin, who says that we are no more important, no more intentional than the dust on your desk. We might as well be like the caged mice for all the agency you're caged mice for all the agency we have in the grand scheme of things. All right, said Andy, neither aggravated nor impatient. But here's your other option. A world in which life has purpose, Melissa said. God put us here for a reason, and that reason is out in the world for us to discover. There's a reason we can see stars in the sky. There's a reason we can dig into the crust of the earth and find out what came before us. There's a reason we were given the kinds of brains that would further your scientific inquiry. There's a reason for life. There's a design behind it. Andy did not look at the clock. I see what you're saying, Melissa, but that's not a binary I'm comfortable with. Your world is the world of coincidence, of meaninglessness. You choose the world that would have us as specks of dust, as mice in a cage. Is that the kind of world you want to live in, Professor Waite? Andy took a breath. Professor? He hated these rushes of memory, these forces that sucked him in like dark matter at the least convenient times, but there he was, out of the shabby lab in the basement of Scientific Hall, and instead in Miami, the apartment in Miami. 4 lushly carpeted and heavily air-conditioned rooms. It was night, and Lou, hugely pregnant with Belle, was lying down next to Rachel in her big girl bed, reading Richard Scarry's best word book ever, giggling together, Louisa's belly rising up and down. Specks of dust, dust to dust. Andy blinked his eyes hard. He came back to where he was. Professor? Melissa tried again. Is that what you want? It's not, Andy said, but I've realized over the years that what I want doesn't really matter either way. Thank you.
Oh yeah, I had that passage in my list too. It's fantastic. Fantastic. Now we set these two books against Laurie R. King's The Bones of Paris, and you have the most amazing feast. The Bones of Paris turns around the central question. What happened to Pip Crosby? What happened to Pip Crosby? I'll leave you right there. And we are in Paris in 1929. The book has two openers. It has a preface and a chapter 1. I want to read you just a slice of how chapter 1 opens, all right? The morning exploded. The room's east windows flared with a hot torment that seared across Harris Stuyvesant's brain, stabbing through his eyes, splintering his thoughts, turning his mouth to old shoe leather, cracked, greasy, foul. Yeah, right? You get the flavor? We've got very different flavor here. Laurie R. King, we're so pleased to have her here. How many of you have read her work? Yeah. Laurie R. King began writing stories in 1987 when her kids finally, they were in school. 6 years later, 1993, she has her first novel out. This woman has written, this is her 23rd novel. So 23 since 93, you do the math. Unbelievable. 6 standalone novels, 14 in her Mary Russell series, 5 in her Kate Martinelli series, and I'm happy to say this is the second now in a series. It'll be the Stuyvesant and Gray series, and she'll tell you more about this. She has degrees in theology, comparative lit. She has life degrees in managing coffee stores and raising kids and growing vegetables and so forth. A really nice thing to say about Laurie is that her fan base is such that there are groups, for instance, there's a group called Letters of Mary that follow the Mary Russell series on Yahoo, and those people are so dedicated. They have now met each other and they travel together, and so the fans have become families, which is lovely. It's lovely. But in keeping, once again, let me just share from the author's mouth here 2 excerpts from interviews. She said recently, being a crime writer, I'm really not interested in the happy stuff. Now, she's much more than a crime writer, but we'll take it. And also, for those of you who know her work, this is interesting and something worth discussing in Q&A. She was asked what might surprise her readers, and she said, they'd be surprised how little I know about the story when I go into it. I tell people that I don't outline, but I don't think most of them believe me. And knowing her work, it's hard to believe. And finally, this was so charming. So she's been on the road too. She blogged on Columbus Day from Columbus, Ohio. And this is what she blogged. I'm speaking at Thurber House, which just tickles me. Long have I lived with the suspicion that Thurber's granny was right, that electricity does leak out of the sockets when the switches are left on. If it weren't some kind of liquid, why would we speak of it as current? I love that. Here's Laurie R. King. Come on.
Thank you. Let me see if I can. Yeah, I've got your. Excellent. All these shrimps in the world. Now, can you guys hear me okay? If I just kind of talk over this, you can hear me okay. I don't like to have, I usually end up throwing them if I'm carrying them. So they had me with one of these little ear things the other day, and I sort of told the front row, just watch out, because it's going to end up. Which it didn't, actually. I was very pleased because I walked out with it. But, yeah, it's been really interesting. I write a series with Mary Russell, who is 15 years old when she meets Sherlock Holmes, and changes his life far for the better, of course, although he might not say that. And I have a series of those books, and I've written 4 in a row. And of course, the way the publishing world works is that it likes more of what has succeeded. So if you have something that seems to be working, for God's sakes, don't change anything, because that's what they want. Well, of course, the publishing world now is feeling a lot of pressure, because the one thing that people probably, I mean, even I would admit that it is probably fairly high on your list of things you can live without if you don't have any money, and if your husband has lost your job and your kids are hungry, is hardback fiction. So I tend to sort of cut the publishers a lot of slack when they say, but we need another Mary Russell. So I have ended up doing 4 Russells in a row, which has really spoiled them. I mean, you never want to let publishers be spoiled and think that they can do it. So I think that the last one, I've always said that the problem with living with the same voices in your head year in and year out is that pretty soon you start to push back and you start doing things to them. So over a period of 3 or 4 books, the 4th book I then send to my editor. And she knows me really well. We worked together since '97. And I have told her this before, but I don't think she really believed it until she got this last Russell book, which is called Garment of Shadows, in which the character wakes up with a severe head injury and amnesia. And I think she then got the message that if I had to do another Russell, bits of the body were going to be left behind. So our conversations after that tended more towards the, so what are you doing next? Instead of, so when's the next Russell? So it was good. I mean, if ever you guys get trapped into a thing, I can really recommend doing some awful piece of violence to your main character. Really, that catharsis is so great. So short of pushing her off the Reichenbach Falls, which is, I suppose, the other option, I like to go back to the way I started as a writer, which was alternating. I would write a Russell and a standalone, or a Russell and there's another series I do, which some people actually remember, Kate Martinelli. She has a fervent fan base, does Kate, who always ask me plaintively when the next Martinelli is coming, and I always say, I don't know. So I like to alternate because I like to really immerse myself in the characters and then just put them aside and let them go and talk to themselves for a while I go and play with this other set of friends. I mean, you don't want to live at a family reunion. Really, you don't. So this year it was really, really great because I got to go outside of the Russell milieu for the first time in 4 years. And I thought I really wanted to pick up these characters that I had done a number of years before. I wrote a book called Touchstone. And my first draft of that, there was a lot of issues going on in my life, and my first draft of that, basically everybody died. Really working out issues in my life. And so I gave it to my editor, and she put it, we came up with a title, and it goes in the catalog. And as I'm working on my rewrite, I'm realizing that I can get pretty much the same effect in the novel without quite so many dead bodies. So sort of one at a time I'd say, well, this one really doesn't need to die. We sort of brush them off and put them back in play. And that one, maybe I don't really need to kill that one. I can just... So by the end of it, I had enough pieces left over. I could sort of make a new pie. And I said to my editor, hey, we could do a series out of this. And she said, no. We've already had it in the catalog as standalone for months now. We can't talk about it. So I said, okay, but I'm going to come back to you on this. Because I really like the characters. There are certain things that you cannot do in the context of a series like the Russell and Holmes series. I mean, here you have a young woman, Mary Russell, who meets Sherlock Holmes. I mean, the basic premise of it is whimsical. And there are certain kinds of stories that you can tell, and other kinds of stories that are really tough to tell. And I, as a writer, found it frustrating that I would want to tell a certain kind of story and couldn't because it was a Russell year. So I allowed myself to really stretch out with The Bones of Paris and play with Harris Stuyvesant in ways that I couldn't with Mary Russell. For example, he wakes up with what is clearly a very, very bad hangover on a hot morning in Paris, next to a woman, and he can't quite remember her name. This is not a Mary Russell book. And I was so pleased when Booklist, whom I love anyway as a reviewer, Booklist came up with a very positive review that gave me a snippet I could use. In fact, we printed it on t-shirts and even better, night shirts, that says, complex, more than a little kinky, and absolutely fascinating. And I thought, oh yeah, I'll take that just fine. So if you want people to think you as complex and more than a little kinky, the night shirts are on my website. But I really have enjoyed, writing something very different, because the voice is different, the pacing is different. The way that I approached it with my editor was very different. I'm very fortunate in that I have one of those editors who really gets her teeth into things. An awful lot of people, especially in genre fiction where I live, they can't afford to spend the time editing a book in the way that it needs to be edited. They tidy it up, see that it makes sense, and send it off to the copy editor to get the spelling right. I happen to have an editor who is really, really hands-on, and she reads things multiple times, and she gives me, I will say, suggestions that I don't like but are usually correct. She has a really bad habit of being right. And this was one of those books that was a real challenge for me because it was so different in pacing. It's really set up as a thriller. They call it a novel of suspense, but that's a very generic term. But it's set up in a very, very different pacing from the other books, and it was a whole lot of fun to get into. And it's all about Paris in 1929. And I chose 29 because everything was falling apart. As you just heard, I don't really want to set a book at a time when people are having a great time. So if you look at Paris in the early 20s, you have all these Americans there, they're getting all their money from home, they're exploring their artistic side, and they're learning all about sex and wine, which you can't drink at home because it's prohibition. Paris is having a great time. By the end of the 20s, and by 1929 when this is set, all of the real artists have gone to the south of Paris, where it's not so freezing cold in the winter. The writers tend to migrate back to the States, and you have this city, this expat community, the American community in Montparnasse, that is all the hangers-on, the drunks, and the tourists. And so I thought, that's that's what I need. So that's what the book is about. And if you want to read it, you can read it. I don't think you need to hear me. So thank you very much.
And I love this. There we go. That's nice. Yeah?
This is fun.
Oh, yeah, it is fun. So we're going to blab a little bit. I think to do this, I'm going to seed some thoughts out and I'm going to pass it their way because we want to talk about some of the themes in these books. Let me not forget, however, to say we could have done a whole day just on the writing itself. These are big books. They're literary books. Just the writing alone, just structural choices, just the poetry of each of these writers. Fantastic. But we're going to talk about content. We're going to talk about mystery. These guys really grab onto mystery and mysteries with an S in an interesting way. And I want to start by talking about mysteries of identity, which are taken on. Each of these books echo similar approaches, but I'm going to emphasize the differences so that the different books can help us explore the topic. So, first of all, just mystery. Of course, a reader's relationship to a book is that of mystery, yes? We start that first page wondering what we're going to get to know and how it's all going to work out, which I love. I mean, we have, Laurie talks about genre, so we have a whodunit, but all of these books share what literary fiction asks, which is why done it? Why do we do what we do? They all share that. And they go back and forth between the notion of mystery as enigma and mystery as secret. So mystery is an essential part of the world, and mystery is a choice that we make to hide things, which is wonderful. And also mysteries. Each of these books is looking at those rites, those sort of hidden rituals that all cultures share, which they usually call their mysteries. And they're asking, of course, one man's credo is another man's falderall. And in each of these books, that notion is played with in an interesting way. So having set that up, and we're going to ask some questions, let me just read you really short little teasers, mostly to help the authors know how I got into the topic with them. I'll finish with, like Laurie, I could just go all day long with the poor, with this issue, and in your book, I'm looking so much at identity as pose, or the role that people play. Like here's a wonderful, as she spoke about Paris 1929, here's a little snippet from her book. People came to Paris because it was cheap, but they also came to reinvent themselves, weaving the city's freedoms, linguistic or racial, artistic or social, and above all, sexual, into a new identity. And that trickles right down. Her book is like a darker version of Woody Allen's wonderful Midnight in Paris, much darker, much realer. So one of the characters is reporting that the famous artists keep passing by you in the novel. There's a wonderful line here where it's gossip. Oh, Pablo Picasso is intense. Man Ray looks intense. Don't tell him I said that. He has a short fuse. So the difference between authentic pose and real pose, so interesting in her book. And then Lauren, I just love, Lauren, where's your, I just love what you do with mice. What her discussion of those lab mice.
The mice don't love what I do with the mice.
Well, the poor, whose name, like they're named C56BL/6 would be a name for a mouse, and what's being done to those mice. And the mice are fighting back. So the mice are being tested to see, the testing has to do with addiction. Do you mind if I just read this little slice here?
Sure.
Some mice had been bred to drink until their neurons seized, and they were, for mysterious reasons, drinking in moderation. While other mice who should have chosen water over wine, were sucking down ethanol like junkies. Mice with brain chemistries that suggested one way of acting were stubbornly acting another way. And for a few delirious moments, Andy wondered if they weren't playing a practical joke on him. The theme of joke is something the two of you share. And then we come to Jillian. Jillian, whose character writing, Margot, says, I am not a girl. Margot writes, I'm not a girl anymore. Neither am I a Jew, as she read to you. I lie, and I lie, and I lie. It's all I know now, all I have, everything I am. So let me pass this to you, Jillian. There's a question that flows through these books, which is, why does identity matter? Does it matter? Does it matter to be authentic? Why isn't it okay to have a secret?
That's a good question. You know, I think sometimes it is okay to have a secret, but Margot's secret in my book is, as you read in the quote, everything she is, basically. She's so consumed with hiding her identity that at a certain point she can't think about anything else. It starts to consume all of her actions and her thoughts and everything she does. And I think for her, she gets so used to lying, she gets comfortable in it. And then when she gets to a certain point, she says something in the book that lying is like her second skin. Yeah. And she also wears a sweater to cover her concentration camp tattoo, and that is also like her skin. And she gets to the point where she says, I can't remember my first skin. And I just think it's about, you know, who are you if you're not yourself, which was a question that I wanted to explore in the book. She pretends, Margie Franklin pretends that she was born in Poland and that she came to America before the war. And so she's completely reinvented herself in this book. But that's not her experience at all. And I think for her, and I was trying to think about us being a survivor or being a Holocaust survivor, and how that became such a big part of her identity. And I think her denial of that, she's not really sure who she is. No one else is sure who she is, but she's not sure who she is either. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it's good. And doesn't, so she is remembering Peter
yeah.
Helt, and doesn't he say it's easier to pretend to be someone than to, what is that?
Well, she has this memory, and he said, in my version of the story, Margot and Peter had talked in the annex about how they would come to America when they were freed. And he said, but we'll pretend not to be Jews, which is actually something that Peter did want to do. That's in Anne's diary. But in my version, he discussed it with Margot. And he said to her, it'll be like an annex in your mind. And hiding who you are will be so much easier than hiding where you are. But as Margot or Margie learns, it's really not easier.
Yeah. Yeah, why don't you pass that to Lauren for a second? We'll just go this way. So Lauren, that issue of hiding is subtle. I'm thinking about Andy, but how does that resonate for you as we're discussing it? He's hiding, yes?
Well,
an aspect of himself?
I talked to some people who have lost their partners, and actually, when I was doing a book club in Seattle for my previous book, and they asked what I was working on. And I said, I gave them the basic gist of the story, and I mentioned that, and it was a small group, it was like 6 or 8 women, and I mentioned that my narrator was a widower, and the table sort of froze, and the faces all sort of turned to one woman who had lost her husband suddenly a few months before, which I didn't know. And I immediately started apologizing. Obviously I was sorry for her loss, but I was also sorry that I would even dare to write about something so painful. And she said, no, it's good that you write about it, but please don't write about it that, please don't make your narrator just fall in love with someone and it's all magically better. Or please don't make him hear a song on the radio and dance with a shadow or something. Like, just don't make it silly. Make it real. And I said, okay, well, how do I make that? How? And I really like, one of the great things about being on book tours is that I get to meet so many people. Like a lot of writers, I really prefer to listen often than to talk, and I love hearing people's stories. And I'm good at, I think, interviewing people, but I was sort of thrust into this interview with an opportunity I didn't want to let slide, but at the same time I wanted to be sensitive about it. And anyway, she said, well, the first thing you want to do is hide. You don't want to be around married couples. You don't want to be around friends or family whose spouses are still alive. And then you go a little crazy and you start to think that, like, the light on the end of the airplane wing is transmitting you a message from your dead spouse, or you start to think that the seagull on a piling is actually your dead spouse watching you, and your literal brain knows that that's not true, but the part of your brain that you want to listen to keeps telling you it's true, it's true, it's true, it's true, it's him. So I really tried, and that was, I hate to make it sound as though her tragedy was useful to me, but her conversation was useful, and I really went home and rethought about the experience of widowerhood in my character, and I made him hide in his little town, in his little classes. He does not really interact with the broader world. He's very resentful of his happily married, slightly buffoonish colleagues. He really doesn't understand why everyone else gets to, fight over the visa bill, and he has to raise his girls alone. And it's easier, I think, for a lot of us to hide than to engage with the fact that we're angry.
Right, and that throws the role of Melissa, who's the intelligent design gal in the book, into a new light for me, because by meeting her, he's being called forward into a part of himself that's buried, yes. There's a line where his children, there's some investigating going to church, and one of the daughters asks, what are we? Not who are we? It's interesting in terms of that as we think about religious affiliation or cultural affiliation, sometimes we ask what, and sometimes we ask who. Were you thinking about that as you?
Well, sure. My son is being raised Jewish, but his father was raised Catholic, and his grandparents are practicing. All his cousins on his father's side are practicing Catholic, and my son doesn't and like a lot of Jewish kids, when they look at it at the Christian side of the equation, that seems much more fun. That has Santa Claus, and I'm one of those horrible Jewish mothers who refuses to even indulge the Hanukkah Harry thing. And it's just so they get Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny, and we get a really fun holiday where we spin tops, and so he said multiple times, not only what are we, but why do we have to be what we are? Why can't we be something more fun? I think that, what Melissa does for Andy in this book is not necessarily, I'm not interested in dogmatic books, and I'm not interested, I told you guys before about the audience member who was disappointed that I didn't give her any answers. I'm not really that interested in answers. I'm interested in why people believe what they believe and why they hold on to those beliefs. And when Andy meets Melissa, what he's really doing is learning how to believe, learning why other people believe what they do, and also why other people's perspectives matter, and also that the worst thing that's happened to him is not the worst thing that's ever happened to anyone. Which means that, and when you can understand that, I think your whole world doesn't become easier, but it becomes more empathetic, and you become a slightly bigger, better person.
Right.
Yeah, let's pass that over to Laurie. I wonder also if we can get that music turned off. It's driving me a little crazy. Laurie.
You know, I have to just hijack
Jump.
you for a minute.
Go.
This business is of how to tell a story that is both a novel and an entertainment, and something that respects the truth of someone's experience, is something that, in my little corner of the literary world, as I mentioned, the genre world, we work with a lot, because on the one hand, the murder is a part of the mechanics of the story. On the other hand, it's awfully easy as a writer to be cheap, and to take the cheap out of, falling in love, and making it all happy in the ending. And of course, even more so in crime, because you have to have an ending. Unlike, you're the one who introduced this literary dichotomy, so I can pick it up here.
Please do.
That the idea of mainstream fiction, the literary world, you don't have to have the same kind of ending that you do if you're writing a crime novel. Crime novel, every so often you'll come across a crime novel that doesn't really have an ending, or it's very ambiguous, and it really, really pisses me off when I come across those, because it's going for, making points with literary stuff, saying, oh, I'm too important to give a real ending. And I really, that's not playing fair with the reader or with the genre. But I think that this idea of not going for the cheap is something that every writer needs to deal with. So.
Absolutely, and for me, your 3 books in different ways, your books are wider than story, much wider. The worlds and the characters are what widen it out into. They're, to me, in a group called Readable and Fantastic Books, forget genre or not. Yeah, dive in.
So what Laurie said, I think, is really important. You called your books an entertainment, and I think that that's actually really crucial. I really like to write books that other people want to read, and in order for that to happen, they have to be entertaining. People are really busy, and nobody has an attention span, and I include myself among them. And I usually give a book about 40 pages or so before I decide that life's too short and I need to find something better. Right? 40 or so. So 40, 20, 2 pages. You get 2 pages. So the cover. So I decide really quickly about what I'm going to read and what I'm going to stick with. And I think one of the things, I often apologize for not having written people say, well, what have you written? Well, first, so have I heard of you? No. Have I heard of you? No. Have I heard of you? Try me. I've heard of everybody. My name's Laurie Grodstein. I haven't heard of you. I know. Although every so often somebody thinks that I'm Laurie Goodstein, who writes in the cover of the Times, and that's cool. So, what was I? So, I wish in a way that I wrote books, mysteries. I wrote books that that were easily describable, because then I wouldn't have to apologize for also trying to write books that are an entertainment, which I think all books really should be. They can be many other things too, but first and foremost, they have to be books that other people want to read. And so I was sort of pleased that my previous book, which is I think over there somewhere, oh sorry, is on Laurie's face, is over there somewhere, was sometimes shelved in suspense. so that I could say this is a suspense novel, and then people automatically got it and got that it would be entertaining, as opposed to just, this is a book about people living their lives and everyone, and that's a much harder book to sell.
Yeah, Jillian, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Lauren said, I'm very impatient when I start to read a book, and I will probably not give it 40 pages. I will probably give it a chapter or two. And then I don't mean to give it up, but I have a whole pile of abandoned books sitting in my office that I just don't go back to. And when I wrote Margot, I'm kind of in the same situation as you, where a lot of people have been calling this my debut. I've seen it in reviews, I've been introduced that way. It's actually my 4th book. My last one was called The Debut also, and my first one. So it's a different type of book for me, I guess that's true. But I had 3 books published all sort of 2009, 2010, and then this was a big gap in between. And I was writing, but I was also trying to sell another book that I wrote that never sold. And so when I came to Margot, I just decided, you know what, I don't know if anyone's ever going to read this. I'm going to write the book that I want to read, that I want to tell. And I think when I finally came to that place, I wrote a book maybe that other people hopefully wanted to read as well. And I kind of got over trying to write what I thought other people wanted me to write or what I should be writing based on the other books I'd written, and I just thought, this is a story I'm going to tell for myself, and if no one ever reads it, fine. And I've been getting this question a lot on my tour. I've been traveling a lot, and people were saying, well, how did you feel writing about Anne Frank's sister, and did you think about other people's reactions? And honestly, I never once thought about other people's reactions when I was writing the book, because I thought, well, no one's going to read this. This story is just for me. So now I am thinking about other people's reactions.
So the mysteries of identity bleed right into mysteries of identity as an author, which I can resonate to all the stories you're telling. I'm going to send that mic back to Laurie, because you're not going to get off so easy, Laurie. In identity, I would love for you to speak to the character Bennett Gray, because of his relationship to what authenticity is. This is if you don't mind describing this man for a second, he reads people in a way that's different than others.
Yeah, Bennett Gray is I suppose the best way of talking about Gray is that he has a case of induced autism.
Ooh,
Which,
good, yeah.
Honestly, it doesn't work that way, but I write fiction, so okay. He, in effect, is killed in the Great War. He's blown up and revived. And when he recovers, he finds that he is excruciatingly sensitive to the world. That any kind of, especially any kind of dissonance, a disagreement between how someone is acting and what they're saying, for example, he finds physically painful. So he is driven to live by himself at literally the end of the world, Land's End in Cornwall, because he just cannot bear everyday interaction with people, because everybody lies all the time. And of course, to find somebody who is in effect a walking truth machine is something that a lot of people would find extremely useful. And that is the setup for the first of the Gray and Stuyvesant stories. The touchstone is that the British government decides that this would be a skill that they would really like to be able to control. That if you had somebody who knew if someone was telling the truth. This, of course, is the 1920s, so it's before a lot of the machinery, although it was being developed, and in fact the Berkeley Police Department in 26 had a machine that was sort of the precursor of the thing that reads your
Lie detector.
Your sweat and the rest of it. Anyway, so that's basically what he is. He is a man who really wants nothing more to do with the world, except the world kind of keeps finding him.
Right, it keeps finding him, and this resonates in Jillian's novel. In Margot, she encounters Jews and survivors who, because they're similar to her, the mask doesn't work, correct? Which is really, really a great resonance to this. So there's a kind of truth teller that we have this within us when we're like enough to someone. There's also a nice discussion, do you want to talk about this for a little bit, that if you're not like, so there's a wonderful discussion about what it means to be an American Jew at the time, how they cannot imagine because they haven't lived. You want to just, yeah.
Right. Well, Margie works for a Jewish lawyer named Joshua, and he is Jewish, but born in Philadelphia, raised wealthy. And a woman comes to him, also a Holocaust survivor, and she works in a factory, and she feels she's being paid less than her Christian friend, and she wants Joshua basically to start this class action suit against her boss. This is 1959. And so he really wants to take this case on, even though it's not going to make him any money, and his father, who's his boss, doesn't want him to, because he feels this kind of kinship with her because he's Jewish. But Margie thinks he can't really understand what she's been through, being a Jew in America in the 1940s, growing up that way when Joshua was a teenager, was not the same experience that Margie had, or this woman, her name's Brida, had, being in Europe at the time and being sent to Auschwitz. So I think there's some level of connection, and Margie says she goes to work at the Jewish law firm, even though in the book she pretends not to be Jewish. She tells everybody that she's Christian, and she tells everyone she's denying her religion, and yet she still lights a candle every Friday night because she really can't deny her religion as much as she wants to. But she says she goes to work for this Jewish lawyer because there's a certain comfort in being around something slightly familiar to her. She thinks, is this what my family and my life would have been like if the Holocaust hadn't have happened? Because they were a relatively wealthy, well-to-do family. Her father was a businessman before the war. And so she feels sort of this connection, even though she knows it's not exactly the same.
Right, and it's that what if that we all, as children, what if I had been born differently? What if we all struggle with, is my identity shaped simply by circumstance?
Exactly.
Huge issue. I'm going to move us over, but if we have extra time and if you guys are interested in the identity issue, oh my gosh, the way Laurie is playing with what it meant to be a woman in 1929, it's just yummy and really funny, but that's a teaser. Let me jump to Mysteries of Time for a second. In these books, we're asking a lot about the past, obviously. These people are haunted in these books in different ways. Lauren's book, these people are haunted personally, and we in fact have a ghost. We have both personal and transpersonal haunting in Jillian's novel, where we've got the Holocaust over, and in fact the book itself is haunted by that diary, the original diary, yes. And we've got endless echoes. One thing that Laurie's book, it's a huge echo chamber, and inside that echo chamber, in Paris, for instance, they're haunted. The wannabes, the leftover artists, are haunted by what it was. In her book, we are haunted also by the future, and we can talk about this. But as she has pointed out, and I'm just going to bring it home for those of you who don't have the dates in your head just super clear, we're in September 1929 in her book. So we, the readers, know that in 1 month, the world is going to change. It will be Black Thursday. The stock market is about to crash. Nobody in this book, as you wouldn't, know that's coming, but we feel a shadow over all of it that is just brings all kinds of interest to it. So time is really an interesting issue here. I'm gonna page through 3 little mini quotes that have to do with the way your book deals with time, and then I'm gonna ask you a question. So in her book, Melissa, who's our creationist, reads from a book called The Macroevolution Myth. And she's highlighted this passage in pink, which I love. She reads, "One only has to do simple math to realize that enough time simply hasn't occurred since life began to account for every single mutation necessary to create something as complex as the human heart, much less the human brain." Then we go to Andy, who's the teacher, who is the Darwinian, and he teaches the following. Darwinian evolution explains everything about us, everything. Then we go to a ghost who is speaking from the grave and who thinks about Andy that he's frozen, that he is haunted by grief. And Andy himself thinks about how grief never goes away, it only changes. So time, we have people in your book, Lauren, wrestling with time on a mental level and an emotional level, yes? Can you talk about how you worked out, because that's complicated to write. You were carrying a discussion and underneath a kind of emotional evolution, I guess we'd say. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. You know, it's funny, as a writer, I just have a very hard time with time. I'm always putting together chronologies that work backwards and forwards, and it turns out the characters that I pin as 14 years old were born in 1979. This is, and the books are set today. This is not only because I'm a terrible math student, but because I just sort of mess time around to suit my needs, right? So I want a kid to both remember Reagan and also be in junior high, and so, but that's sort of like, it feels a little bit like a fiction writer's prerogative that you can just mess around with time. But it turns out it also is a copy editor's huge headache. They don't like it when you bend the space-time continuum to suit your own screwed-up needs. As far as time in this novel went, this was the first novel I've ever written which was totally straightforward. It starts in the beginning, it ends in the end, stuff happens in the middle. My previous books have, like, my first novel took place mostly in flashback, and it was set during the 3 minutes it took to take a vintage 1992 pregnancy test. And then the next novel took place over a weekend and was also stocked with flashbacks. So this is the first book that I've ever written that started in the beginning, ended in the end. It does have some moments, obviously, of recollection in it, but it's not, the forward action in the book is actually happening chronologically. I am interested, I think, as I said before, in the way that grief messes with our rational brains. My grandmother was killed. She was hit by a car when she was 82 years old and crossing the street 7 years ago. My sister was pregnant with her first great-grandchild. And I was very close with my grandmother. I loved her very much. I still do. And I found this weird, it was the first surprising death in my life. And I was struck very much by how my rational brain just went away and how my irrational brain was always working, so that I thought I don't believe in ghosts, but I believed in her ghost, and I don't believe in the supernatural, but I believed she was with me, and that made total sense. And that's the ghost that I gave Andy. So he's a Darwinian who does not believe for 1 second in supernatural phenomena, but his wife is just there. Her ghost is just in the room, and that's, somehow he's able to live with that contradiction.
Right.
And he doesn't question it.
It's wonderful. We're going to open to question and answer now, but let me just say that Time and Death in Laurie's novel is so different because artists at that time are taking a decadent and surrealist approach to things, so the bones of Paris, bones become very, very important. And I think we can, because we've all walked so closely to the Anne Frank diary, we can just feel how these issues are going to well up and forward. But what is so unusual is to do that through Margot, which is wonderful. So let's just have you guys talk to us. Anybody have any questions for these guys? We would love it. Don't be shy. Should we walk this? I'm going to walk this around to you guys. That's what I'm going to do.
Here we go. Great. Now, does Margot ever consider not hiding her Jewishness? That it might be just easier to assimilate? I mean, she is hiding her Jewishness.
Right.
I mean, go back and say who she is and what the story was.
She does, and that's part of the book, and I don't want to give a spoiler away, but one of the things I was really interested in my research is I knew, obviously, this horrible, the horrific acts of anti-Semitism during the Holocaust. I didn't know that much about Philadelphia in 1959. I thought I did when I started, because I grew up near Philadelphia, so I thought, sure, I'll set the book in Philadelphia. But I didn't grow up in the city, and I didn't know anything about the 1950s, so that ended up being as much research as Europe during the Holocaust for me. But what I did learn is there were still really blatant acts of anti-Semitism in Philadelphia in the 1950s. And Margot learns this pretty quickly too, and she keeps thinking in her head. She has this post-traumatic stress, but she thinks if people know she's Jewish, something bad can still happen to her, even in this place that she had once thought was safe. You know, she thought Philadelphia, they said it was the city of brotherly love, which is why she came there. But these things are still happening, not to the degree that they were in the Holocaust, but that's her reasoning for still
Where
hiding.
did her father settle?
He was in Switzerland, and he remarried, and that's a part of the book also.
Okay.
You'll learn,
All right.
yeah, how she feels about that.
Good question.
Who else?
Who wants? Anybody got? There we go.